Are you guys ready for the Blob meta? Because I don't think you quite are. Not at least until you watch this Snapper Pass video where we're going to talk about mechanics, counters, deck lists, and I got some key synergies and even some key synergies for the future when other DATAMINE cards end up joining Marvel Snap, and they might help out old Blob here because he is a 6/4 on reveal. Merge your deck into this and gain its total power. Ongoing can't be moved. There's a lot going on with this card, okay? So I'm going to break it all down for you guys in this video. But my quick thoughts about it is that it's going to be really fun. I think this card is going to be a blast to play with. It's going to be a lot of fun trying to read and assess how much power is actually in your deck so that when you play the Blob, you get a crazy statted card. I think this might be the single card, the one card play that nets the most power in Marvel Snap. There's a few high power plays out there, but they require a lot of setup, a lot of synergy. Blob's just checking what's in your deck. If it's a lot of power, he's going to eat it all up. You're good to go. It's also really nice to have a card that makes use of the cards that you did not draw, because sometimes those cards are just dead and they don't help you win the game, whereas Blob is really making use of your entire deck. Literally. So we're going to get into the mechanics of Blob in a sec, but really quick, we have the spotlight caches. So you have the Living Tribunal, a Series 5 card, and Ravonna Renslayer, a Series 4 card. Ravonna was recently buffed. She's pretty solid nowadays, I would say, and she's growing in popularity. Living Tribunal, bit of a meme deck, but it can pull off some crazy shenanigans and be strong in the right circumstances. So they're not bad cards. If you don't own them, might be a good week to go for it, especially if you're hyped up for the Blob. But otherwise, if you're not too thrilled about these cards and you don't own them, they're probably quite passable. And I would say Ravonna tends to lean to the more valuable option, and she's the cheaper option in terms of tokens. So again, you got to look at your collection. You got to decide what you want to get. But there you go. Let's get into the mechanics of Blob. All right, when it comes to Blob, the most important thing that we can understand about this card is what actually happens when your deck merges into Blob, right? There's a few things that came to mind. 1, ongoing abilities. 2, on reveal abilities. 3, abilities in general. So really quickly, basically remove the text from all those cards. We don't even have to think about it. Unless a card is accumulating power in the deck, and there are a few cards out there, well, then it doesn't really matter if they merge into Blob. He's just looking at the power. They haven't actually activated on the board, so there's going to be no on reveals that are triggered before the card merges into Blob. Ongoing effects aren't going to take effect. I'm thinking of stuff like, I don't even know, like Blue Marvel or even Cerebro somehow. I don't know. Just any of those ongoing effects, it's not really going to matter. They're going to go straight into Blob before they have a chance to activate. But there are some things that are accumulating power while they're in your deck, which is actually going to help increase the size of Blob. One of those cards just came out last week, and that is Shaw. Shaw can gain a bunch of power in the deck, and that gain power is going to contribute to your Blob when it merges. Another way to gain power into your deck is Okoye. You can play Okoye. She's going to give a buff to all those cards. All that buffed, gained power is going to contribute to Blob when he merges. But then there's other cards that gain power that don't actually activate until they are played. Those ongoing cards that might actually read their power in your hand won't actually have that power when they merge into Blob. So we're looking at cards like Morbius, right? I'm thinking Null also is going to work the same. I believe they changed them so that they work in the same fashion. You don't see the power of those cards until they're in your hand or on the board, and that means they're at 0 when they're in your deck. So it's not a very good synergy to pair those with Blob. And I'm speaking of destroy and discard, the cards that merge into Blob are not destroyed or discarded. So they're not going to join the pile so that when you play Hela, they're all going to come back, or your death is going to be discounted greatly. It's kind of like these cards just disappear into the Blob per se, okay? That's how it's working. Merge is a little bit of a funny mechanic in Marvel Snap, and we only have a few cards to work off of for mechanics when it comes to merge. But another thing about this card, Blob, is that he has an on reveal and an ongoing effect. Now, we've only ever seen this with Electro. gaining that +1 max energy, but at the cost of ongoing, you can only play 1 card per turn. Well, Blob can't be moved. That's his ongoing ability. Yeah, it doesn't really much like that. That one compared to his on reveal doesn't much matter, but there are a few nuances where it's going to help. For instance, an arrow play possibly, so he doesn't move away, perhaps location implications, or even Sauron. Right? So you play Sauron, it's going to remove the ongoing ability, but it's going to remove the entire text from that ongoing card, which means when you play Blob, his on reveal, it doesn't exist anymore. It's not going to trigger, as well as his ongoing ability. He's just going to be a vanilla 6/4 that in fact could get buffed by Patriot because he doesn't have an ability anymore, but that's a whole different story. You don't want to run Sauron with Blob. All right, now getting into some of the pros and cons. So like I was saying earlier, potentially the highest power single card play. So I'm not talking about a card like Null that can get to crazy power totals, right? He requires other cards to be destroyed, other cards to be played to destroy. I'm talking about literally just throwing out your Blob. He consumes the entire deck and he's going to be like a 40 power play. It's going to happen probably fairly consistently because I think the decks that you run this guy in are going to have a lot of high power cards to increase his probability of getting to probably on the low end 14, 15 power, and then on the high end 40 plus. It's going to be pretty wild. It's going to be crazy times with Blob. So he could be the highest power single card play. And that pairs really well with a few key synergies that I'm going to get to later. But another thing about this card, and I'm going to go to the pro and the con here, is that I think this is going to be a high win/cube rate when played, but a low win/cube rate when in the deck or in hand. The reason I'm saying this is because this card, in my opinion, it gives me a lot of Hela vibes. So Hela has notoriously been the highest win rate, cube rate card when played. Because if you go to actually play Hela, then you've probably set up the board in such a way that it's just guaranteed that you're going to put out so much power with that single card play. And Blob falls under that category. You play him, he gets you a lot of power. Probably going to win you the game because you're playing him knowing you have a lot of power in your deck that you want to consume. But if you don't draw Blob, there's huge inconsistency issues because now you're drawing all these other high power, possibly clunky cards that you can't really play. And if you did draw those, then maybe your early game is in the deck. And then by the time you actually do Blob, if you do, you might not actually get a significant amount of power and it might not be worth it. We have to throw in some early curve into our decks. So I feel like there's going to be a lot of draw dependency. But on the other hand, he has the ability to just be the nuts draw. So I'm thinking of like a wave into Blob and then Taskmaster to copy him. Seems nuts. That's a lot of power. Just throw in an armor a little bit earlier to protect one of your Blobs, and it's going to be a good time. So I think there's going to be a lot of cubes to be gained when you're running a deck like this, but you might have to retreat a little bit more than you're accustomed to with other decks because the consistency isn't quite there and you're not drawing great every single game. Right? You got to retreat and look for when you have the combo, and then you have a very fun, a very crazy Blob play. And lastly, and probably my favorite part about this card, is that it is the #1 Darkhawk counter. You play Blob, you eat all the rocks up, anything else they threw into your deck, see ya later, Darkhawk, you're going to 0 power. The only way it doesn't is if your opponent doesn't have priority and manages to play Korg or Rock Slide at the end of the game to toss in some rocks. But even then, we're reducing that Darkhawk by like at least 10 power. It is such a nasty counter. So that is going to be a lot of fun. I think it's a deserving counter because Darkhawk has been one of the best 4-drops in the game for the last calendar year. Came out in December of 2022, and now finally, December 2023, Blob is here to save the day. So there you go. That is the mechanics for Blob. If there's anything that I missed, let me know in the comments below. I like to try and help you guys out. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to find the answer. All right, let's get to some counters. So if you don't want to pick up Blob, because this will be a Series 5 card costing you 6,000 tokens, well, look no further than a few counters here. Well, you could look further, because there's a lot of counters, dude. So Cosmo, of course, denying the on reveal, that's going to suck. Your Blob ends up just being a 6/4. Look out for that. Shang-Chi can destroy the Blob. If you end up with priority, you play your Blob first, and then your opponent plays Shang-Chi, destroys it. That's going to suck if you don't protect it with armor or anything of the like. Alioth is also pretty nasty, because you'll never have an opportunity to even gain that power if Alioth is played with priority. So it's in this weird scenario where if you do have priority and you play Blob, you got to be worried about Shang-Chi. If you don't have priority and you play Blob, you got to be worried about Alioth. So I don't know. You just got to read and assess what's in the meta and what's not, and based on their deck if they're running those sorts of counters. But those are all very nasty. Then there's some other stuff like Shadow King. Shadow King's going to take away all that power you gain from eating up your deck. See you later, you're going back down to 4. It is gained power. And then some other little nuanced ones that I think are interesting and kind of just holding a place for a few locations that do this, or just draw in general. So anything that's going to make it so that you have less cards in your deck and more cards either on the board or in your hand. So there's cards like Yondu, which is just going to destroy a card in your deck. Gladiator also does that. Possibly, actually probably not because of the decks you play Blob in, but you get the concept, right? Cable's stealing a card, Mantis is stealing a card. There's a bunch of locations that are going to make you draw cards that are very common. You actually don't want to draw. You want to get to Blob, but you don't want to get to Blob any faster than you naturally would. Which is why a card like Magic actually isn't all that good to play with Blob and is actually another counter in a roundabout way because it's allowing you to draw another card. And in a deck with Blob, drawing another card more than you would have naturally in a game could mean deducting your Blob by like 14 power if it was like Giganto or something like that, right? Or what if it is that Infinite? That's 20 power taken away from your Blob. And if you're playing cards on turn 4 and 5, you can't play the Infinite, then you got to play the Blob. It's going to be a bit rough. So anything that makes you draw, anything that takes cards from your deck, these are pretty severe counters to Blob. Which brings me back to the inconsistency issues. I just fear that there's going to be a lot of instances where it's going to be actually difficult or not worth it to play Blob to get his high roll potential unless you have already drawn the perfect combination. And there's other things we could do. We could also, play Moon Girl to make it so that we have a lot of cards in our hand, or even like discard Swarm. So you got a bunch of Swarms, you keep them in your hand so you're not able to draw cards, clogging your deck to maximize your Blob output. That means you're relying on those, first 4 or 5 turns that you draw Blob plus his combo. So that's where I'm just not too sure. And there's a lot of counters out there for sure. So let's talk about some of the DATAMINE cards that could help out Blob. There's actually not a whole lot in the DATAMINEs that I think directly helps out Blob. I just pulled right here the 2 highest power cards that have been datamined as of December 2023. And it is Scar, a 6/11, and Call Obsidian, who was just datamined recently as a 4/10. They could actually work and help out Blob quite a bit. I mean, Scar wants a lot of 10 or more power cards to be played. You're probably running a lot of those in your Blob deck, so maybe there's potential there. Might not hurt putting that in a Blob deck, especially with the 11 power upside. And then Call Obsidian, I think, actually will work beautifully with Blob because I think Thanos is one of the better decks to make use of Blob because of the amount of cards you'll have in your deck and the draw consistency, sort of, or inconsistencies rather, because you'll keep some of those high power cards in your deck, draw some stones. Mind Stone was just recently nerfed. That actually kind of hurts, I think, Blob a little bit, very minorly, because you want to make sure that you are drawing those stones and not the high power stuff. But regardless, it's still drawing 1 cost, so you can still make it work. And I think Call Obsidian is going to be great. Either you draw it, you probably have a stone on the board, so you play the Call Obsidian, that's just a fantastic value, or he stays in the deck and you use Blob and you eat him up. It's pretty great. So I think those are the 2 best options. Literally the next card after this with the most power is 7 power. So we need some more higher powered data mines for old Blob here. Now let's get to some deck lists. So I've already kind of talked about some of the key synergies when it comes to Blob, but I think one of the best combos that we have in our first deck plus sized is the Wave and then Blob and then Taskmaster. I think that's one of the best ways to get a lot of power essentially in 2 lanes, because we're probably going to end up with about 60 power. You just got to watch out for those natural counters, but I think that might be our best course of action. And the way we can facilitate this is we have big cards like the Infinite or Destroyer, 15 and 20 power respectively. That's a lot of power to consume. I also tossed in some lower curve high power cards like Typhoid Mary and Red Skull. Just the idea being that I want to try and either have a lot of power in the deck, or if I do happen to draw those cards, I can actually play them and have a decent curve and a decent amount of power output, make use of those cards. And then otherwise, we're using Dracula because we're probably going to have one of these higher power cards in our hand at least at the end of the game, so you can get a lot of power out of your Dracula. And then Psylocke to ramp in if we don't draw Wave. And then I got Domino even. I know it ruins my chances of drawing blobs marginally, but I kind of like the idea of just forcing a draw on turn 2 so that maybe I can play that card and then increase my chances for Dracula to hit something big, increase my chances of having something big in the deck for Blob if I do happen to draw him. So I'd probably cut Domino, but I thought it'd be a cool opportunity to try out the card. Never get to play it. Sunspot is pretty good because we might end up passing quite a few turns, and Armor, of course, to protect our big stuff. So that is plus sized. And then we got Infinity Boulders, and this is really just a Thanos deck, except we got bigger stones this time around in Blob. Blob is going to eat up those Infinity Boulders. He's going to eat up all these big cards. And you know what? We don't actually care too much in this deck how much power Blob gets to, but he might get to crazy power totals. And yes, I got to get this out of the way. I am running the crazy risk in Lockjaw. So you play Lockjaw, you put a stone there on turn 4, let's say. Ooh, this is going to be a lot of fun. And then Blob comes out and eats your entire deck. Now you're not drawing on turn 5 or turn 6. That might suck. It might lose you the game, honestly. But that's why I have Moon Girl in here. Because if we have Moon Girl in hand, at least we can play her on turn 5 and then have more options on turn 6. And maybe that'll be a card that it's just fine. And there's, that's a high roll, low roll, if you want to say, because you get a really big blob, and then on the lower end, you just have less options to try and win another lane with. Alternatively, we could roll into Thanos, we could roll into Infinite, we could roll into Doctor Doom, Giganto, Vision, move them off, play another card there, Nightcrawler, move them off, play another card there. So I just like it too much. I think it'd be a lot of fun. This card is already very high rolly anyways, so why not just play the lottery with Lockjaw? I think it could be a really fun deck, but time will tell. And then lastly, I got Disco Blob. Basically, this deck is just a Hela deck, but I tossed in Blob there because, I don't know, the idea being we have a lot of high power stuff. If we don't draw Hela, or we don't draw some of that high power stuff, we can make use of it. We discard Blob and then resurrect him with Hela or Ghost Rider, and he's going to activate his ability, and all of that power we didn't draw gets squished into Blob, which seems like a nice use of the cards that we bring to the deck. And like I was saying, Hela decks already have that really high win rate, but also, you have to retreat a lot because you didn't draw the right cards. And Blob, I think, is going to fall in line with that. So they work pretty well together because you'll know if you can win a game or not pretty early on based on what you've drawn. Or at least by turn 5, if you don't have one of those key cards, you can kind of read and assess the situation and get out of there. So I like that potential for Blob as well. But at the end of the day, when we look at this brand new card that is costing us 6,000 tokens, we have to decide or ask ourselves, is Blob a snap or pass? All right, I'm probably going to get torched for this, but whatever, dude. Like, this game is kind of expensive. I'm not buying a whole lot of bundles lately. I got to pick and choose which cards I'm going to go for. And for me, Blob is a pass. But the thing about this month of cards, they're very niche. It's hard to really say, snap, pick up this card. It's going to be so good because it's going to fit in just a few decks and do a very single purpose effect. And if you like playing those type of decks, then it's a great pickup because you're going to have a lot of fun with it. But me personally, I'm just not. And I think it's going to be a little bit more underwhelming than a lot of people are hoping it's going to be. But I think it's going to be a lot of fun when it works, which makes me want to say it's a snap. But I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to say that this card is a pass. This game is just not cheap. They haven't really talked about making it cheaper recently, unfortunately. Series drops are non-existent at the moment in time. And at least we're getting one Series 4 card a month, but it's still just not moving the needle for me. So for now, I gotta just leave it as a pass. But if you do choose to pick up Blob, I hope you enjoy it. I think it's gonna be a great time. Thank you so much for watching this video and checking out all the mechanics, talking about some counters, some synergies. It's always a great time to talk snap or pass with you guys. So I appreciate you stopping by. Thank you, and I'll catch you next time.